you for the warm Coolidge welcome. Hello, hello. It's great to be here. What a beautiful crowd, beautiful theater. So hands up, who's seen the movie before? Awesome. All right, so you know all about it. Right, well then I'll tell you a little bit about how our work relates to Amadeus. So the first time I saw the movie, I was about 9 years old, and it really made a lasting impression on me. Not only about music and genius and creativity, but also about jealousy, anger, guilt. Lots of things that we're still talking about a lot in our lab. So as you heard, Mind Lab at Northeastern University, shout out to Mind Lab members here. We're interested in music and the brain. So part of my research time I spent thinking about why we know what we know about musical knowledge. Right? So musical structures and functions, like all musical systems around the world, have scales, have rhythms, and have melodies. And so my job is to ask why. And the other part of my research time, I spent thinking about how we can use this musical knowledge that we have towards the greater good. Right? So how can we use the cognitive science of music, the neuroscience of music, to design interventions for those who need it the most? And so in our lab, we have a behavior lab. We have a jam room where people can come in and play music. We also have an MRI machine, so we can look at structure and function of the brain. And we also do quite a bit of sound synthesis, and you'll hear some synthesized music that our lab has used to test different hypotheses we have about music and the brain. And we also have an EEG system. So this is neuroimaging system that's more relatively fine-grained temporally as opposed to magnetic resonance imaging that's relatively fine-grained spatially. So we're trying to get good spatial and temporal resolution and understanding of how the brain responds to music. But that's not why you're here. This is why you're here, right? So there's something about music. I took this picture just a couple of months ago when I was on sabbatical trip. I got to go through Salzburg, which is, of course, the birthplace of Mozart. And right next to the house where Mozart was born, they sell Mozart chocolates. Right, and it was really a wonderful day. It happened to be my birthday. I get to look out the same window that Mozart would have looked out when he was a child. And then I got to go downstairs and I got to buy chocolate. And then I got to walk through the town of Salzburg, and there's a statue of Mozart, quite literally towering figure over the city of Salzburg. And I also got to see artifacts like the original magic flute. And also some very curious early music science. So we're talking old-fashioned, old-school music science. This is a drawing of Mozart's son's ear compared to a so-called normal ear. So this is the inscription on the right. It says, Mozart's ear in comparison with an ordinary ear, watercolor from the 19th century. The drawing from Nissen's biography of Mozart shows the left ear of Mozart's younger son, Franz Xavier Wolfgang, compared with an ordinary ear. He allegedly inherited the strange form of an external ear from his father. So it's as if that there's something about this structure of the ear that predicts the genius, right? So I mean, I think this is one of the many threads that I think also comes through in the movie, and maybe is the reason why sometimes musicians get a little bit angsty or antsy when watching classic movies about musical genius, is that it seems to perpetuate this myth of the composer genius, where it just seems so easy, right? So you get, it's like Mozart didn't even have to try. There's one scene that has always been made a really strong impression on me, where Salieri has been practicing for a long time, and then Mozart shows up and just owns it, right? He just plays the same piece immediately, and then he plays it even better, right? And so, but it's not all composers that seem to have this myth. Right? So, for example, why is there no Beethoven chocolate, right? There's Mozart chocolate, but there's no Beethoven chocolate. And so Mozart somehow seems to have this myth, it seems to embody this myth of the composer genius. And so, so where does it come from, right? Is it from nature? Is it from nurture? You've probably all heard of the nature-nurture debate. And what is the capacity of music making, right? So those of us in the field of music science think about musicality as the human capacity to make music, right? That includes the human capacity to hear small differences in pitch, and also to play in tune, to play in rhythm, but also to create new musical structures. And so we had a book that just came out last year. It's freely available on MIT Press if you scan that QR code, where we specifically look into musicality as a product of gene-culture coevolution, right? So it's not that you necessarily inherited the gene for music or even the gene pattern for music, and it's not necessarily that creativity is entirely a product of culture, but it's somewhere in between, right? So these interactions between the biological part and the cultural part of musicality is something that we're very interested in. And so particularly, I think I'll tell you a little bit about some new research we've got in my lab recently about musical creativity. And hopefully, creativity is something that you're all familiar with, right? You're familiar with the idea of new ideas and important ideas that got put out. So iconic figures like Einstein, right, who supposedly created the theory of relativity, which is of course both useful and novel and beneficial and desired by an audience. But what is useful in music is a little bit harder to define, right? So musicality as defined by the kind of music that Mozart wrote is quite different from musicality as defined by the kind of music that Louis Armstrong made, right? And so, and these iconic figures like Mozart and like Louis Armstrong, we would call them big C creatives, right? So these are the famous creative figures that have gone on to influence the culture. But I'm also interested in little c creatives, right? I'm interested in what the student is doing in the practice room when they're trying to get good at something. And I'm interested in that difference between different kinds of musical training. So I myself am a classical musician, so I played violin and piano, sort of good Asian girl thing for many years. But I'm also very interested in the jazz-trained musicians. You look at some classically trained musicians versus jazz-trained musicians. Classical musicians play in tune, show up on time, and then the jazz-trained musician, they just maybe show up that you play them a piece of music and they can just play it back and then they can riff off of it. And I've always been very curious about how you can do exactly that, right? So that scene where Mozart just takes a piece and then riffs off of it is something that we've been very interested in. All right, so I've been studying for a while now jazz improvisation as a window into real-time creativity. By real-time creativity, I mean the kind of creative process that's unfolding very rapidly over time. All right, so we have come up with a few of these simple musical motifs, and I'll just play you one of these. All right, so that's number 12, right? And we have different jazz-trained musicians, classically trained musicians, and non-musicians come in and play these back and then riff off of it. So this is what one jazz musician did. So that's pretty great, right? So it's a very simple, original little motif, and this guy went on and made something very beautiful out of it. And what's really amazing to me is that every time they do this, it sounds different, right? And so I've just shown you that jazz musicians can indeed improvise, but are they also more creative outside the practice room? Right, so there are classic tests of creativity that maybe I'll run one on you guys right now. How many things can you do with a brick? What do you do with a brick? Just build a house. Great. I remember that project, dropping brick on ketchup. You can drop it on ketchup and see how far it splashes. Lift weights. Spatchcock a chicken. I've never heard that one before. Wow. All right. Okay, so you guys are a very creative crowd. Right, so people who are more creative usually come up with more answers, and they also come up with more original answers in that they'll say things that you can do with a brick that no one else says. So I've already heard a couple of new ones today. This is great. And it turns out that we found that the jazz musicians came up with higher fluency as well as higher originality than the classical musicians and the non-musicians. So is this subserved by the way their brains work, right? So there are classic studies that look at the networks of the brain and how they function over time. One of these networks is called the default mode network, and it's usually active when you're doing nothing in particular, when you're just daydreaming. And it tends to be anti-correlated, right, opposite directions, as another network in the brain called the executive control network, which is active when you're doing something, right? So right now you're listening to me talk, you're maybe trying to remember what I talk about, and then maybe after a while you might zone out, and that is enabled in your brain by a switch between executive control network function and default mode network function. And what we found was that jazz musicians actually have more functionally connected default mode network with the executive control network compared to the other two groups. And so in a nutshell, these networks that are usually important for mind wandering are actually more connected to networks that are important for cognitive function. And that might be, that rapid switch back and forth between the default mode network activity and the executive control network activity might be one of the features of that let improvisers both mind wander and also hone in on different kinds of executive functions. So what about musical sounds that you might hear? So here I have a very simple chord progression. Let me play that again so that it starts on time. Right, so this is a very standard 1-4-5-1 chord progression in music theory. It's like saying, I take my coffee with cream and sugar, as opposed to this one. So that middle chord is slightly unexpected, right? That's like saying, I take my coffee with cream and NutraSweet. And then here's the last one. Right, and so that's just a little bit ungrammatical, right? That's like saying, I take my coffee with cream and swimming, right? So nothing wrong with swimming, it just doesn't go with coffee. And so we had different groups of jazz and classically trained musicians just rate how much they like these chord progressions. And remarkably, we found this difference between groups where the jazz musicians actually liked the NutraSweet, the slightly unexpected version, more than the other two groups. And then that last version, right, the ungrammatical, unexpected chord progression, while both non-musicians and non-improvising classical musicians really didn't like it at all, the jazz musicians actually just hated it less. Right? So it seems like there's something about these unexpected musical structures that engage jazz musicians and improvisers' brains differently. And we started to look into brain indices of that. And it turns out that within 1 second of hearing that unexpected chord, you get these world of differences between what the jazz musician's brain is doing, what the classical musician's brain is doing, and what the non-musician's brain is doing. In that the jazz musician's brains are earlier and more sensitive to the unexpectedness, but they also forget the unexpectedness sooner. And it's the classical musicians that around 800 milliseconds after the unexpected chord happened, the classical musicians' brains are still analyzing that unexpectedness as if thinking that it's wrong, right? Whereas the jazz musicians have actually gone back and forgotten all about it and are ready to move on. So to me, this really gets into the difference between improvised music and through composed music or prepared music. But I also wanted to look a little bit into into a way to to push the research forward that doesn't rely so much on jazz versus classical training, right? As we know, only some people have access to specific forms of musical training. It's very much a socioeconomic dependent thing. So I wanted to come up with one way to test creativity and musical creativity in a way that had nothing to do with this training. And so what do we mean when we talk about musical structures that people are familiar with? Right, so I've just shown you a 1-4-5-1 chord progression. And this is, of course, composed using the Western musical scale. So musical scales around the world, just a little bit of math here, right? It's composed of discrete pitches that have predictable mathematical features, right? So for example, an octave, that is the orchestra tunes to A440, which is 440 cycles per second. And one octave above that is twice that, right? So it's 880 cycles per second. And within that 2-to-1 frequency ratio, we've got 12 logarithmically even divisions of that scale to form the equal tempered Western chromatic scale. And so Western scales, for example, just use different steps along that scale. So here is one example of a nice Western sounding piece of music. So in contrast, different cultures use different steps along that 2-to-1 frequency ratio. So a Chinese pentatonic scale just uses 5 different steps along that chromatic scale. So here is same musician playing on the same violin, but a very distinctly Chinese piece. So even if you haven't heard that piece before, you should be able to recognize that there's something about the steps along the scale that it's using that sounds distinctly Chinese, right? Even though they're playing it on Western instruments, but it just sounds Chinese. Right, so neither of these cultures used a different scale, that's called the Bohlen-Pierce scale. So Bohlen and Pierce were 2 engineers, actually, that independently asked, why do musical systems have to be based on the 2? Why can't they be based on the 3? All right, so they made this new scale, and this is a piece of music that's composed from it. All right, so now we're a long way away from Mozart now. But this is one completely different and yet mathematically feasible musical scale. Right, so nobody has training in this system. Right? So what we wanted to do was use this non-Western musical system to test musical creativity. Right, so Corinna Parrish, who was in my lab, shout out. Yay! Right. We developed this game, right? So it's written in a tool called MaxMSP. It's a bit like a digital audio workstation. If any of you are familiar with that, it's a musical sequencer / beatbox type of game where you can just make as many melodies as you want, and you can save them, and then you can have someone else listen to them and rate them for how creative they are. And it turns out that you can get a lot of data out of these new melodies that people generate with no training. And it turns out that longer melodies are still rated as more creative, and melodies that have more different pitches are more creative, although you also get an inverse U type of relationship where there are some melodies that use every possible note, right? Just think of an ascending scale. Those get rated as not that creative. But one thing that is very strongly predictive of creativity is the intervals and the entropy of the intervals. So the more different intervals you use, the more your melody is rated as being creative. So here are some melodies. Right, so that's a medium creative melody. And this is a more highly creative melody. This is one of the higher creative melodies. And here is the least creative melody. All right, so that's, I think it's easy to see how the information content of these melodies, even though they are quite different now from the Mozartian classical melodies, can be a window into musical creativity in this century, right? And another feature of music is that it makes you imagine stories. Right, so we have wonderful collaborators, Lisa Margulis in Princeton University, who's done some really wonderful work going into China. And they weren't even testing Chinese people in China. They were testing a special group of minority called the Dong people, who are living in a tiny village called Demon, where they don't have as much exposure to Western media. And they got these people from Demon and a bunch of American undergraduate students to listen to music from the Western cultures and also from the Eastern cultures. And they just asked, what stories do you imagine when you listen to this music? And then they were able to apply some natural language processing tools to define a semantic space. So this here is the semantic space of imagined stories from these different excerpts that were either in Chinese music or in Western music, and that were made by either Chinese people or, the Demon people or the American students. And what you can see is that given the same piece of music, the people in Demon imagined stories that were more similar to each other, whereas the people from the US imagined stories that were more similar to each other. That means that the same piece of music you might hear as cowboys. A person in Demon might hear as mountains. Right? So there's something about music that is filtering through our culture into something that's shared consciousness or shared subjective experience within a culture. So then I said to Lisa, let's take this Roland Pierce scale music that nobody is familiar with and have them imagine stories. And we did this not with the Demon people, but with people from Beijing, right? So they're obviously recruited from China, as opposed to people recruited here in Boston. And we replicated this difference such that people in Boston were still imagining stories that were more similar to each other, and people in Beijing were imagining stories that were more similar to each other. And what was really exciting about this was that for each song, you can get a consensus story. Right, so the average story that you might hear. So I'm just going to play you one example of this Dvorak. So who imagined the story when they heard that piece of music? Any takers? Oh yes, what story did you imagine? Springtime. Anyone else imagine a springtime view? Okay, yeah, quite a few. Anyone else want to imagine a different story? Dawn. Can you tell me your story? Dawn and kids revolting. against teachers. Okay, great. So dawn is actually one of the most commonly imagined stories. So that's close to what we would call the consensus narrative, right? It's the middle of that shared semantic imagined space. Whereas the revolting against teachers is fairly outside that semantic space, right? So we can treat this as an individual difference measure, right? So if your story is close to the consensus given your culture, then you're close to that consensus narrative, right? And as opposed to someone who's telling quite a different story. And it turns out that the distance between your story and the consensus story was predictive, long story short, was predictive of how many uses you can come up with for a brick. All right, so that was pretty exciting. So I think I'll just spend a couple of minutes to summarize. I've blown through a lot of research. Creativity is something that depends on predictions that you learn from your culture. And that these predictions engage the reward system in the brain, which is shared with the default mode network and its twists and turns with the executive control network. And this reward system predicts the ability to make new music and to imagine stories during music listening. So I hope you have fun, and I hope you imagine lots of stories while we're experiencing this story together. Thank you, and enjoy. Yeah.